Welcome to the show. You're listening to Green Hell, a Vietnam War podcast. Join me as I explore the history of the Vietnam War, remember the sacrifices and experiences of those who were there, and preserve those lessons learned and paid for through blood and unimaginable human suffering. Welcome back to the show, everybody. It is Friday, November 22nd. I'm your host, Stephen Comstock. Thanks for tuning in. Today is a day that I've been looking forward to for a while because we're going to be talking about Operation Lea, which is, as you'll soon learn, every Airborne Ranger's wet dream. Lest we get ahead of ourselves, let's take a minute to catch up. So it's been maybe a month and a half since I recorded my last episode. A lot's happened. Chances are, no matter where you fall on the political spectrum, if you're a United States citizen, you've got some strong feelings one way or the other. But all I can say is, at least in this country, you are allowed to have strong feelings one way or the other. There are other places in this world where you can have strong feelings, but you damn well better not tell anybody about them. Communist countries tend to be those places. Since the last episode that I recorded, I've significantly improved my fighting position. That is, I basically built out my studio. Well, let's not go so far as to call it a studio, but I took the spare bedroom that was kind of sort of an office and I decorated a little bit. I hung up a foam pad in front of the wall, so it's a little bit more acoustically viable in here. And I'm going to get a new microphone someday soon, but they're a little pricey, so probably gonna wait until after the holidays. But hopefully the audio in here sounds a little better. The last episode I did not record it in a very acoustically viable location, so, and you can tell, unfortunately. But going forward, the quality of audio will only improve. All right, so I know, for those of y'all who really are curious, I'll paint you a quick picture of what my studio looks like. I've got my standing desk elevated, standing up, dog Luna standing up, looking out the window. Probably might hear her bark. On my desk, I've got my Vietnam books, got a picture of my granddad, got two pictures of my Ranger buddies from back in the day, got some weird art, got the Ranger Creed hanging up for inspiration. We've got my medal from the Leadville Heavy Half, which was half, but it's hanging there as my only recent accomplishment, unfortunately. And in front of me, I've got this tapestry. It's covering the foam, which was just a memory foam pad that I hung up on the wall. It looks really disgusting, so I covered it up with this tapestry. So not too bad. There's more room for improvement, though. But anyway, I won't bore you with the details. Getting back on topic. 1947, Vietnam. What the hell was going on? Well, if you'll remember, last episode, we talked about the Battle of Hanoi. The Battle of Hanoi ended with Ho Chi Minh, his entourage, and pretty much the entire Viet Minh army running for the hills, literally. From the time that the Viet Minh retreated out of Hanoi until Operation Lea, which takes place early October 1947. Basically, what was going on in the entirety of the country was, in the north, the Viet Minh were on the run. The French were waging campaigns to retake the productive rice yielding zones between Haiphong and Hanoi and surrounding both of those places, not necessarily just between. But they were also taking over cities such as Lang Son and Cao Bang. These are significant because they are right on the Chinese border. And what happens a few years down the line is that when the Chinese Civil War concludes and Communist Mao Zedong takes control, he's able to adequately support the Viet Minh with significant military and material aid from the communist bloc, that is China, newly communist, and the Soviet Union, the OG communists. However, until we get to that point, it must be remembered that the Chinese were dealing with their own civil war, but the French were controlling these two key towns on the northern border, which allowed for at least the perception that the French were controlling a significant part of northern Vietnam. However, as we're going to see, no matter how hard they try, the Viet Minh escape all blockades and any attempt to pin them down like water through fingers. The bottom line is that in the spring and summer of 1947, the situation in northern Vietnam was that the majority of the Viet Minh were on the run, kind of pushing northwest towards the Chinese border and hoping to take refuge in the vast mountain range and hilly areas that constitute that part of the country. To the southeast of northern Vietnam towards Hanoi and Haiphong, it's what's known as the Red River Delta. And like any delta, it's a flat, marshy area that was super great for growing rice, but not super great for taking cover and hiding from the onslaught of the French horde, which had just taken Haiphong and was now pushing to follow the Viet Minh and wipe them out. So the Viet Minh do what anybody does in that situation, and they head for the hills. Why? Because the hills are hard to conquer. Ask literally any civilization that lives in a mountainous region, and you'll find out that pretty much none of them have been conquered. Afghanistan, for example, Switzerland. I mean, Red Dawn. They were in the Rocky Mountains hiding from the commies that invaded the United States in that movie. So I don't need to explain to you guys the importance of mountains, but add mountains and jungle, thick jungle canopy in an age before thermal imaging, ISR assets, satellite imaging, or significant aircraft capabilities, and you've got all the perfect conditions to escape and evade a major military power. And that's exactly what happened. The Viet Minh escaped and evaded while the French consolidated control over urban areas in northern Vietnam. In the south of the 16th parallel, that is, the situation was different, as we've discussed. The Viet Minh in that area never had the chance to consolidate control. So what happened was the sole focus of the southern effort by the Viet Minh was to, one, create underground networks of citizens, guerrilla fighters, and intelligence operatives that could mount an effective resistance. This included sabotage, assassinations of French political entities, and terrorist attacks. Less violent operations included scouring for supplies, since they were ultimately cut off from the north, but they were also finding supplies and funding the operation using the same capitalist system that they were ultimately fighting against. They piggybacked off French colonial trade, but when you have resistance operatives working in the industries making money off French colonialism, they were able to funnel those dollars, or rather the piastre, which is the French Indochina currency at the time. They were funneling that money to fund the war effort in the north. So it's pretty interesting how this, in a, I don't know, how do you say, like a counterintuitive action, the communist Viet Minh were literally utilizing the profits generated from French colonialism to fund the rebellion against French colonialism. But anyway, not to go down too deep a rabbit hole, but it's important to realize that you don't just wage war willy-nilly. It takes a lot of supplies, a lot of money, and the French basically took over the South before the Viet Minh really had much of an opportunity to seize all the material products that are required to run a government. So they were left on their own to wage the more guerrilla war. I call it the more guerrilla war, but it really was, because from the beginning, from the Indochina War all the way through the fall of Saigon in 1975, the South was always under the thumb of Western powers, whether it be French back then or later to come the United States. The South was always waging a really guerrilla war with shadow networks in place, funding and funneling cash, weapons, and supplies all over the place, later to use the Ho Chi Minh Trail through Laos. But I'm only saying all this to illustrate that you had a lot of subterfuge going on in the South, whereas in the North, the Viet Minh were on the run, basically trying to hide in the jungles while the French consolidated control over the urban areas. If you're really curious as to the specifics and details of the economic leverage that the French utilized over the Vietnamese people regarding their currency and colonialist capitalism, you can read more about it in The Road to Dien Bien Phu by Christopher Gasha, which I've been reading a lot for this and following podcast episodes, but it's really cool. It's really cool. There's a lot of detail, a lot of things you wouldn't necessarily think of he brings up, so highly recommended if you're looking for a more granular level. Another interesting thing that I learned about the Southern resistance effort against the French is that there was a large focus on maintaining a few main aspects, and that is, one, propaganda. You got to keep the propaganda flowing. As soon as the citizens stop hearing all the the horrible things that French people are doing, or as soon as the fire of patriotism dies low and the people start to not feel super motivated to die or suffer for whatever perceived cause they're being sold through the propaganda, then you got a problem. So the Viet Minh were hell-bent on maintaining the airwaves, keeping the radio station online, and keeping those French, the Vietnamese that were sympathetic to Vietnamese independence, keeping them appraised of the situation and feeding them a hopeful narrative so that they're motivated to keep trying. It was really a whole of society effort. Kids were stealing supplies wherever they could. Villagers were increasing crop production of specific food items in order to feed guerrillas operating in the area. Guerrillas themselves would do hit and run, ambush, and other guerrilla warfare tactics to just basically harass the French or, disrupt their supply lines. And that's the best that they could do. And they did a pretty good job all the way through the entire end of the war, as we'll see. Really, in the South, an important thing to remember is that those operating in the South were later to become what we know of in the United States as the Viet Cong. We'll get to that later on, but all the Viet Cong were just the guerrilla fighters in the rural areas outside of the urban population centers that had been and were continuing to wage the Southern resistance fight for Vietnamese independence. The leader of the Vietnamese resistance operation in Saigon and South Vietnam was Nguyen Binh. And I'm going to quote from Christopher Gosch's book a couple times, but I think this is some important to know detail. And that is, so in early 1947, as battles raged in Hanoi and Hue, he secretly entered Saigon to identify enemy targets and prepare his underground networks for urban warfare. All right, so say what you want, but General Nguyen Binh, he wasn't a pansy. He took some significant personal risk to go to occupied Saigon and the other, southern Vietnamese supply hubs for the war effort and set up an underground network. And you got to think, that's minimum death, right? If you get caught, you're minimally getting just domed. But worst case scenario, you're getting tortured. And the French were known for being pretty horrible torturers during this conflict. So you're getting tortured. Think batteries and clamps and, that's it. That's all I'll say. Batteries and clamps. Enough said. Anyway. So, significant risk, but, you got to give credit where credit's due. I guess not all generals are sitting behind a desk in the rear off and giving bullshit speeches to the boys. General Nguyen Binh was also responsible for identifying and ordering assassination attempts against French bureaucratic and military targets. All right, I'm going to read a quote that General Binh made on May 20th, 1947, while explaining to his soldiers why they had to take the battle to the French and their Vietnamese allies. He says, quote, "Destroying Saigon is a legitimate and humane action. It is regrettable that scorched earth policies were not applied from the start of hostilities. In the history of the Southern resistance, this serves as a lesson, a painful experience. It was both a political and military error to simply ask people not to collaborate, to evacuate government buildings without destroying them, as was done in Hanoi. The broadcasting station Radio Saigon continues daily with its counter-propaganda, calling our fighters rebels. The electricity station in Saigon continues to power the enemy. The French arsenal and the naval shipbuilders are still repairing boats and weapons for French colonial troops who kill thousands and thousands of Vietnamese. The Bank of Indochina continues to hold in its hands the economic destiny of Cochin China. If I remind you of this painful past, it's so that you can learn from its lessons." End quote. Perhaps not too surprising, the majority of the operational squads in these urban zones in Saigon and the Saigon area, they were mostly workers that had either come from the unions or were from rubber plantations. So It's a classic case of the workers of the world unite. At the height of resistance operations in 1948 through 1949, it's reported that General Nguyen Bin's urban warfare operation squads totaled into the 2,500 range. And one more quick snapshot into the terrorist activities going on during this time. I'm going to read another passage from Christopher Gosch's book, but I'm going to paraphrase what I have highlighted. And that is, in 1947, an all-female Minh Khai platoon came to life and was named after the communist heroine that the French executed outside of Saigon in 1941, a Ms. Nguyen Thi Minh Khai. This platoon numbered 30 young women aged between 18 and 22. Most of them came from poor urban or semi-rural families and usually worked as street hawkers. In March 1947, DRV authorities recruited a Vietnamese woman and a newly arrived Cantonese immigrant to infiltrate the famous Chinese-run casino Le Grand Monde. Outfitted in Chinese clothes, the Chinese woman talked herself and her companion through the front door and then into the heart of the casino. A short while later, their grenades went off, creating panic in the club. Later on in that same year, Chinese owners and the DRV reached a deal, whereby Le Grand Monde paid protection money to avoid the repetition of such events. According to French intelligence, the owners had secretly agreed to make a 2 million piastre down payment and thereafter deposited between 5,000 and 10,000 piastres to DRV agents from daily gambling takes. So there you have it. I mean, one man's mob organized crime, shakedown, bullshit is another person's resistance. So just think about that as an American. Imagine X political entity that you hate or X political ideology that you hate gets enough power and gets enough momentum in public consciousness that now you've got secret agents going in, conducting terrorist activities, and then whatever corporate entity paying that group to maintain the equanimity to keep things copacetic. I mean, I don't know what to say. As an American citizen, that shit doesn't fly in my book, but this is communism for you, you know? It starts somewhere, and I guess any revolution has its share of not super savory activities. But lest you thought that that was the worst, it's not. It's not. In fact, here's another event that occurred in the same vein. On 10 June 1948, the DRV turned to the all-female Minh Khai unit. Of the 4 women entrusted with this mission, the oldest was 24, the 3 others aged between 15 and 16. Because of their soft-mannered nature, cool-headedness, and physical beauty, they successfully crossed through the security checkpoints, and this is the security checkpoints of the Majestic Cinema in Saigon. Once inside, they waited until 8 p.m. when the feature film started and the lights dimmed. It was their cue to lob their grenades to where the French officers were sitting. 3 devices went off, killing several sailors and naval officers and wounding innocent bystanders. In the commotion that followed, all but one of the female assassins escaped capture. The news made the paper and unnerved an already anxious city. Nguyen Bin had attained his objectives. Women had allowed him to do it. And so again, that's quoting from Christopher Gosch's book, The Road to Dien Bien Phu. Highly recommended for anybody looking to learn more about this situation in the South. But we'll get into more of that going forward because it's not an isolated event. I don't know the specifics off the top of my head, but I can tell you that there were other instances where officers out to dinner with their family would get gunned down by gunmen who would roll up and just murk them straight out of The Godfather, pretty much is what we're talking here. Like, hey, there's a guy, we know where he's at, we don't care if his family there, we're going to go out and we're just going to murk him, and then we're going to run away. And that's what happened. So it's pretty messed up. There's a lot of documentation about it. Senator Kennedy and his brother, President Kennedy, who was a senator at the time, and his brother, I'm not sure what his brother was, Bobby Kennedy, but I'm not sure his rank. They were in Vietnam in the 50s, and they wrote about how they could hear gunfire in the night as, you know, various groups were fighting each other, and how all the cafes in Saigon had bars over the windows, and that the atmosphere was just not pleasant. Nobody was there having a great time. everybody was a little bit on edge because you could never be sure that you weren't going to get caught in some crossfire because somebody in your orbit was a target of a Vietnamese Viet Minh assassination team. All right, so enough of that. You get the idea of what's going on in the south. What's going on in the north? The Viet Minh, Ho Chi Minh, they're fleeing into the jungle. I mean, there's not a whole lot to be said about what's going on. They flee from zone to zone, you know, taking refuge in the dense jungle canopy and the mountainous regions, which are extremely hard to patrol, especially back then. They didn't have the modern tech that we have today. And so they were able to escape, right? So eventually they end up in the city of Bac Can, which is in the northern area, pretty close to the border. It's one of 3 cities that the French are going to end up attacking during Operation Lea, but I think it's Operation Lea, sorry. But I'm not going to get ahead of myself because we're going to get to that in a minute. But one thing to note is that in the spring of 1947, Ho Chi Minh is in diplomatic talks with the French. And the French High Commissioner for Indochina, Émile Bollaert, Bollaert, I don't know how you say that. Émile, that's what I'm going to call him, Émile. He was open, and his top priority was reopening negotiations with the Viet Minh. So a month after the French smash the Viet Minh out of Hanoi, they're like, hey, you know, can we negotiate, buddy? Like, we kicked your ass fair and square. Like, are you willing to come to the table and talk to us about it? Like, maybe we can bury this. But alas, in somewhat of a mic drop moment, Ho Chi Minh says to the French, in the French Union is no place for cowards. I would be one if I would accept. That is, the provisions that the French were offering for the Viet Minh to concede to the French. Also during this time, Ho Chi Minh was trying hard to get the United States back on board with their cause. Not that we were never not on board, but we definitely never were on board. It was we'll appeal to the United States because they really are our best option. I mean, he emphasized the nationalistic nature of the struggle against the French colonies and was appealing to, you know, the fact that America, the United States, is founded on rebelling against British colonialism. But alas, America was like, nah, we ain't doing that. And despite his best efforts, the United States did not acquiesce their request for aid. So they tried a lot. I mean, I talked about it early, how, you know, they've tried since World War I, more or less, to appeal to the French, but the French weren't having it. And then they appealed to the United States way back, and the United States wasn't having it. So the rest is history. But there is a counter argument, and that is that when you're reading these tales, it's easy to be like, oh yeah, see, the Viet Minh were trying to get the United States to help them get peace. They were trying to negotiate with the French for peace and for, a way to end the war without having to shed tons and tons of blood for independence. They were hoping that the French would, acquiesce to some level of degree that was acceptable to Ho Chi Minh. Now, here's the thing. Is it really seeking peace, or is it just a delay tactic? Because while you're in negotiations, you know that your enemy is going to lower the temperature a little bit, because if they're keeping the same aggression, there's no way that negotiations are going to succeed. So as just a natural fact of engaging in talks, you're opening the door for the possibility of peace. Therefore, you're lowering the operational tempo of the enemy, right? So Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh, in my opinion, this is just my opinion, but to me, it seems like they had no real intention of settling anything with the French, but they were utilizing it in the precious months after the fall of Hanoi, while their forces were all in retreat to the north and just establishing significant subversive activities in the south. They were using that period to reconsolidate, reorganize, and refit for follow-on activities. So that's my take on it. That's the tactical, that's the strategic thing to do. I don't see any reason to believe that the Viet Minh had any serious intentions to acquiesce any French demands at that point. Perhaps a modern parallel would be Hamas and Gaza, right? They they find out, and then Israel stomps them and just demolishes anything that they had going. And then it's like they're trying to use hostages as leverage to, and also international pressure from the chaos that they created to lower the op tempo of the Israeli Defense Force long enough for them to reconsolidate, reorganize, and refit for follow-on activity. That's why, in my opinion, it's bullshit when any enemy of a friend claims, woe is me, we need a ceasefire. Well, yeah, of course they want a ceasefire so they can reconsolidate, reorganize, and refit for follow-on activities. It's the oldest trick in the book. Everybody knows that. Anybody who doesn't know that needs to listen to this podcast because they might learn something. For the United States' part in the whole issue, it's reported that on September 24th, 1947, American consuls in Hanoi and Saigon reported to Washington that the French were planning a major military operation against the Viet Minh. They recommended that the U.S. discourage the French from attempting to reimpose the colonial status quo. So we tried to talk them out of it, but ultimately they didn't listen. And this brings us to Operation Lea, led by French General Jean-Etienne Valois. I have no idea if I said that right. General Jean-Etienne Valois. Yeah, I'm going to look into that. I guess it's more like Jean-Etienne Valois. I don't know. JV. That's what I'm calling him. General JV. All right. Jean-Etienne Valois. JV. Okay. Anyway. By October 1947, the French have an idea of where the Viet Minh and the Viet Minh High Command, if you will, was located. And that was the Viet Bac province, or rather region. I don't think it was a province. The Viet Bac region, but specifically the city of Bac Can. So just keep in mind, all of this stuff is north. It's in the mountainous, jungly regions close to China. And the fear is that if they escape into China, then they'll be gone because that's outside of the scope of what the French can even possibly manage. Like, they're not cleared to go fight inside of China against the Viet Minh. So if the Viet Minh can escape into China, and at the time there were factions of the Chinese population that were very much pro-communism fighting against non-communists in their own civil war, it was a strategic concept for the French to block off the north border so that the Viet Minh couldn't escape, and then they would basically draw them into a set piece battle and crush them. That was like the entire French strategy for years to come was, we're going to get the Viet Minh, we're going to pincer them in a classic pincer movement, and we're just going to crush them because we got superior technology and we got more people and we're better trained. Besides, the Viet Minh were just a bunch of ragtag, skinny, malnourished, misguided guerrilla fighters that had no chance at all going up against the imperial majesty of the French military might. Or so the French would have liked to believe. All right, so Operation Lea was the French hope that they could knock out the Viet Minh in one major military operation that captured or killed the key leadership and put an end to the Viet Minh revolution. And, personally, if I were the French, I would try something similar. If you can end the fight pretty quick because you have superior military technology and skill, why not try? Why not try? If you can knock it out immediately, then it saves a lot of people's lives, money, and wherewithal. But as we'll see, things did not conclude as optimistically as the French had hoped. However, this operation is really cool in my humble opinion. But first, for some quick historical background, you need to know what was going on back home in France at the time that Operation Lea was concocted and then executed. The French legislature had issues with the cost of the conflict, especially considering that they were just rebuilding their country after World War II. And so the government had promised to reduce the French forces from 115,000 to 90,000 men. Furthermore, at one of France's other colonial holdings, Madagascar, an uprising was occurring there, which required a 15,000 French troop contingent to rapidly deploy there. However, the French High Command thought that considering that a sizable chunk of its forces were going to get redeployed elsewhere, they might as well make use of their entire entire military force while they had it and throw everything they had at trying to crush the Viet Minh. And so 20 battalions worth, that's 15,000 men, were deployed to crush Ho Chi Minh and his Viet Minh, holding out in the mountains north of Hanoi. This Viet Minh territory in question was a 100 by 100 mile triangular shaped region that spanned north of Hanoi and included the border frontier with China. The basic concept of the operation was that an airborne force would airdrop into Bac Minh, knock out or capture the Viet Minh High Command, i.e. Ho Chi Minh and his entourage, and 3 columns of infantry would push into Viet Minh country and mop up any resistance. The 3 French columns of attack were as follows. Groupement S, led by Lieutenant Colonel Sauvignac. Groupement S executed a dawn airborne operation to capture Ho Chi Minh and his entourage on October 7th, 1947. 1,137 paratroopers jumped directly over the rebel headquarters located at Bac Con, Cho Moi, and Cho Don. All right, so for anybody who doesn't know or who has never heard of airborne operations, I recommend you watch Band of Brothers. Good depiction of what goes down, but that's neither here nor there. So here's the concept, right? You put a bunch of infantrymen rigged up with parachutes and plus all their gear onto a plane. That plane can only hold so many people, but you pack it full, right? Then that plane flies over the enemy territory and all the paratroopers jump out, right? Now, the concerns are less about getting to the ground than they are being on the ground. That's not to say that there aren't airborne hazards, which there are. Primarily, one, maybe your chute malfunctions and you plummet straight to the earth. That's the worst case scenario. Another bad thing that can happen is you get tangled up on something on your way out the door and end up being dragged along by your parachute static line. That's the second worst thing that can happen to you. The third worst thing that can happen to you is somehow between jumping out of the door and hitting the ground, you get injured by either a static line hitting you in the arm, ripping your bicep open, that happens, or you hit your head on the plane because you had a bad exit and the prop blast smashes you back into the skin of the aircraft. That can happen. Sometimes you might have a perfectly fine chute open and you're good to go, but next thing you know, one of your paratrooper buddies is blown into you and now you and him are tangled up together, which can cause a situation where you lose lift, your parachutes collapse, and you spiral in a death spiral to your untimely demise. But really, the biggest concern is that your chute's going to open, you're going to land, but you're going to land and you're going to break your legs. You're going to break an ankle, or you're going to get stuck in a tree 60 feet in the air, and you're going to be just dangling there for someone to find you and kill you. Now, I know an airborne ranger, I won't name names, but he's a true American hero. He sacrificed his ability to walk for this country. He jumped in Grenada, which was an operation in the 80s. He landed pretty hard. He had a bad landing. He ended up on top of his mortar plate, which paralyzed him from the waist down. And the thing that strikes me the most about his situation and his story is that he conveys the true and utter sense of terror that one must feel, completely helpless, alone, separated from the rest of your stick, waiting for the enemy to find you. And since you're paralyzed, you're stuck, you're sitting ducks. They're going to overrun you and you're pretty much dead. It's only by the grace of God that you are either undetected or friendly forces arrive and find you in time, which is what happened in his case. Now take that terror and add it to a jungle where you can't see anything. You are surrounded by enemies. And by the way, you don't know where your buddies are. It's that kind of thing that every paratrooper is thinking about before they jump out of the plane, especially in a combat operation such as Operation Lea. Now, the most likely bad situation is that you jump out of the airplane perfectly fine, your chute opens, you make it down to the ground, and you either get stuck in a tree and you're just hanging out, or you have a bad landing and you can't walk. All right. Now, the next most likely bad situation is you can walk, but you're completely lost and separated from your ranger or airborne buddies. So that's the beauty of airborne operations, though, is they're relying on the troops to be trained well enough and to be of such mental fortitude that onesies and twosies will find each other despite the conditions, despite the enemy, and despite possibly being under heavy fire. And then those onesies and twosies will find others. They'll form small groups. Those small groups will form other groups, and so on and so forth until you have a cohesive fighting force that can defeat the enemy. Now might be a good time to point out that in a major airborne operation, Army doctrine states that acceptable losses are 30% of the fighting force. Now, based on all the things that I just described, you can kind of see why that number might be so high, especially when you add in the fact that those troops jumping out of the planes may be taking heavy enemy fire from the ground and may get killed before they even hit the ground. However, in the case of Operation Lea, it was a surprise attack. The enemy didn't know they were coming. In fact, it was such a successful surprise that when the paratroopers found Ho Chi Minh's headquarters, there was still mail waiting for his signature on the table. Unfortunately, there were spies that somehow knew of the operation and had just enough time to make it back from wherever they gleaned this intelligence from, presumably the urban populations from which the airborne force kicked off from, and they made it in time to get Ho Chi Minh and his entourage to flee the area by the skin of their teeth. And the main objective of capturing Ho Chi Minh and his entourage failed. However, the French paratroopers were able to capture one of Ho Chi Minh's ministers, as well as Japanese and Nazi combat instructors that the Viet Minh were using for training. Also, they captured important supply depots, and furthermore, and perhaps maybe the most moral outcome, was that the French paratroopers were able to rescue 200 French and Vietnamese hostages that the Viet Minh took with them when they left Hanoi in December 1946. Now, if taking a couple hundred hostages sounds familiar, it's probably because you're thinking of Hamas. Anyway, so in the meantime, as Groupement S is conducting their airborne operation to capture Ho Chi Minh and his entourage, Groupement B, which was led by Colonel Beaufret, which constituted the main force and was constituted of 3 armored battalions, 3 infantry battalions, and 3 artillery battalions, reinforced by an engineering battalion and a transport battalion. Now, for context, that's the equivalent size of today's entire 75th Ranger Regiment. So as Groupement S was executing their airborne operation, Groupement B left the border fort of Lang Song and executed a long slog up Road 4 towards the northernmost town of Cao Bang. Their primary objective was to seal off the northeastern Vietnamese border region and prevent the Viet Minh from escaping into the sanctuary of China. As Groupement B was pushing up Route 4 and fighting off any enemy resistance, the remaining airborne troops that had not yet been deployed with Groupement S were utilized to capture key bridges northwest of Cao Bang until Groupement B had broken through and conducted link up with them. So again, you have a situation where airborne forces are kind of on their own, tasked with holding a key piece of terrain and or infrastructure and waiting for another military force to conduct link up with them so that they can move out together for follow-on objectives. It took Groupement B from October 7th until October 12th to finally make it from Lang Song to Cao Bang and conduct link up with the airborne troops that were holding the bridges. Once Groupement B conducted link up in Cao Bang, they deployed a portion of their column, which was the Moroccan Colonial Infantry Regiment, southward to conduct link up with Groupement S, his hard-pressed paratroopers who had been on their own fighting some of the enemy's best troops since the 7th. Now, just think about that for a second. These airborne troops that had landed in the hopes of finding and killing Ho Chi Minh quickly found themselves surrounded by a very eager and well-armed contingent of 40,000 Viet Minh, eager to stop and crush the French and protect Ho Chi Minh and his entourage at all costs. So it's pretty impressive and also harrowing to me to think of being one of those paratroopers. You know, you survive the jump, now you're there, you're on your own, and you're just holding up in whatever hard structure structures you can find, holding off the enemy, and hoping you don't get overrun before the friendly forces can conduct link up with you. Now, I just want to interject my 2 cents worth on this subject. But so basically, this kind of combat that I'm describing, being on your own in a fortified position, holding off the enemy until reinforcements arrive, to me, it doesn't get more infantry than that. Like, that's it. There is no more hardcore infantry task than being in a fortified position, whether it's a compound that you commandeered, a cop that you've built up, a fob that's well established, and you're told, hey, we've got supply coming at some point in the future. You're on your own till then. We may or may not have assets that we can provide you. So best of luck, buddy. And to be fair to the regular army and the regular infantry of the military, United States military, they're the ones doing it. It's not so much special ops that are doing that. Special ops are doing cool missions where they're out of base and they've got great amenities, and then they hop on helicopters, go do a mission. Maybe they're gone for a day or 2 or 3, maybe a week, but they're coming back to a nice, well amenitied fob or base, and they're going to refit, relax, and get ready for the next mission. The dudes I'm talking about are out there on their own, taking fire daily, and there's nobody coming for them. Total self-reliance situation. I'm lucky and blessed that I never had to be in any kind of combat like that, but to me, it's badass that there are dudes, even in the global war on terror, who are fighting in this exact way, and nothing but mad respect. It may not be as glamorous as doing some cool night raid, high value target interdiction, or some other special op, but it's what is the backbone of military operations. Gaining and holding territory against the enemy until you can overwhelm the enemy. Anyway, getting back to the Moroccans. So the Moroccans pushed down south to conduct link up with Groupement S, and it took them 3 days of bitter fighting to break through the Viet Minh lines and join hands with the paratroopers of Groupement S, who had held out on their own for a total of 9 days. Okay, so now on October 9th, Groupement C, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Communal, pushed north along the Red River and Clear River in their French Navy landing craft tanks. This riverborne task force was comprised of 3 battalions. Their primary objective was to push north up the rivers and act as the Western Task Force of the pincer movement. Groupement C found early on that the soft sand of the riverbanks were providing significant difficulties for their landing craft. As a result, Groupement C left 1 battalion at Truyen Quang, while the other 2 battalions pushed northward along the river towards Chiem Hoa. At the same time, an element from Groupement B was dispatched to push southwest along the river and conduct link up with Groupement C at Chiem Hoa. As this element from Groupement B pushed southwest to conduct link up at Chiem Hoa, they encountered numerous enemy sabotage bridges and relied heavily on the skill and ingenuity of the combat engineers to overcome the obstacles along the river from Nguyen Bien all the way to Chiem Hoa. On October 19th, 1947, they finally conducted link up with Groupement C at Chiem Hoa. They were a full 120 miles inside Viet Minh controlled territory. All right, so I'm going to read a passage from Bernard B. Falls' Street Without Joy. The main communist redoubt in Indochina had become a vast pocket, except for the fact that, in that kind of war, in that kind of terrain, the term encirclement was of course totally meaningless. Between the towns and key points, there were vast stretches where whole Viet Minh regiments could slip through, and did. On November 8, 1 month after it had begun, Lea was called off. So, ultimately, Operation Lea goes down in the books as a failure because they did not succeed in their primary objective of capturing, killing key Viet Minh leadership and crushing the resistance force altogether. However, I would say it wasn't a total failure because 1, they inflicted heavy casualties on the Viet Minh. 2, they knocked the Viet Minh back on their heels and forced them further into escape and evade mode. And 3, they managed to rescue 200 hostages. So say what you want. I think it was at least a nominal success, all things considered. But, you know, I think it was a good mission. I think it was a pretty cool operation. It was a cool operation. I mean, they used airborne troops to sneak attack to try to do a capture kill of HVT targets. It's pretty badass. And it was a combined operation between airborne, riverborne, and mechanized forces, which you just don't see. Very unique operation. They rescued 200 hostages. Anyway, so ultimately the Viet Minh suffered 9,500 casualties, but I will add, and I find this somewhat humorous, Bernard B. Fall has next to that casualty figure in parentheses, but were they really all combatants? Question mark. So LOL, probably not, right? Probably quite a few civilians that they tallied as combatants, which isn't anything new in the history of warfare, unfortunately. Okay, now I would be remiss if I did not mention, and I almost forgot, and I feel bad, but the 3 columns of ground troops were supported by the 4th Fighter Group, which was equipped with Spitfire 9s, along with German-built Junker 52 tri-motors and American-built C-47s as transport vehicles, as well as French Marine liaison aircraft and quote, ancient American-made Catalina flying boats that assured long-range reconnaissance. So the ground troops, they had air support. It probably saved their butts quite a bit. Not to be forgotten. That's the 4th Fighter Group, provided air support for the ground troops against the Viet Minh. Okay, so now there is an epilogue to this story, and that is that 12 days later, on November 20th, another month-long operation called Operation Lea was executed. It was designed to, again, kind of pincer crush the enemy, encircle them, and wipe them out. But as happened with Operation Lea, the Viet Minh slipped through the lines and escaped any attempt at pinning them down and wiping them out. After that second month-long operation, the French learned their lesson. December 22nd, 1947, the French pulled their troops back to the lowlands. However, there was an exception to this. Not all the troops came back to the lowlands. There was a string of forts along the Vietnam-China border that we'll go into probably next episode, not sure yet, but essentially these border forts were completely isolated and cut off from all of their brethren, which were down in the southeast lowlands, and basically left to fend for themselves and try to hold the line in an attempt to prevent the crossing of Viet Minh and Viet Minh supplies to and fro China. Now, we'll get into all that later on, but just think about that for a second. Does that make any sense? No, not really. But we're talking about the Vietnam War, where a lot of things don't make a whole lot of sense, and it only gets worse. Anyway, thanks for tuning in, everybody. I'm going to wrap it up now. I want to give a special shout out to a couple people. One is my dear friend, Willito175. Thanks for giving me a little bit of encouragement to keep going. And I want to give another shout out to my brother, whose name has been redacted for OPSEC reasons, but he gave me a call the other day and was telling me that I was doing a good job, which really meant a lot to me. So thanks, bro. I'm going to try to keep it up and hopefully only improve from here on out. And also want to give another shout out to 175 brother Richard Cantu, host of the Over the Top Great War podcast. He sent me an email the other day saying to keep up the good work. So really appreciate that. Also recommend his podcast. One last thing I will say is that going forward, I'm going to try to put out maybe smaller episodes in between these bigger ones. So there's a lot of little interesting minutia that I think would be best suited for a 5 to 6 minute episode, maybe a little bit longer, but not much longer than 15 minutes probably. I'm going to try to make those more frequent, or at least in between some of these longer episodes. That way I can keep the momentum going. And thank you for forgiving the fact that I don't have a lot of sound effects in this episode. In fact, I have none. And don't worry, I'm gonna have sound effects. I'm not done with sound effects. I just been dilly-dallying on this episode for too long, and to add sound effects and to find the sound effects, it just takes a lot longer to produce an episode. So for this episode, no sound effects, fear not. Maybe you like it. Maybe you like it that way. I don't know. If you have any comments, hit me up at greenhell6969. That's my X handle, at greenhell6969. Shoot me a comment. Shoot me a message. You can also like and subscribe. Leave me a comment on Spotify, Amazon Music, or Audible. Working on getting other platforms, but that's a work in progress. That being said, I do want to credit the folk over at www.zapsplat.com who provided the background sound, the jungle background noise that you've heard here today. All right, I think that's it, everybody. Take it easy. Be brave. Be cool. Be badass. Talk to you next time.